Login accepted.
All right, so now that it's 1:05, we'll begin. So today is networking week, and we'll be going over the fundamentals of networking and some network security. Hello, I'm Nat. That's me. Right now, I'm a sysadmin intern at Genentech. I'll be CCDC captain this year. Last year, I was the networking lead. I'm also involved in Swift. So this year, I'll be the vice president, and last year, I was the alumni coordinator. And I like frogs a lot. That's also my Discord. If you have any questions, you can always contact me there. Yeah. All right. So this is what we're going to cover today. We'll be talking about intro to networking, competition networking, the client server model, firewalls, and the lab. So let's go into intro to networking, not the LinkedIn networking. So a network is pretty much just a system of interconnected network devices that can communicate with each other and share resources to one another. And network devices are anything on the network. These can include computers, phones, routers, switches, and even printers or like RF scanners. To be a network device, you have to have at least one network interface card, and this allows you to communicate on the network. And these network interface cards, or NICs, are wired or have a wired or wireless connection to the internet. This is an example of a very basic network. So you have your router here, and that's connected to the internet on one side. And on the other side, it's connected to a local network. In between the router and the switch, you have a firewall. And that firewall can sit either on the router, the switch, or another dedicated device. This switch is connected to these workstations and servers, and it helps communication between them and to the internet. This is a less basic network topology, but it's more realistic for a company to have. So for instance, on the left side of the firewall, you could have a dev environment where you'd be developing like code or whatnot. And on the right side of the firewall, you would have a development environment, or sorry, a prod environment or production environment for all of the production. And there would be a firewall in between these environments to make sure that nothing really can go in between them, or very specific connections are allowed between them. And this prod environment would be directly connected to the internet. And now I'll be going over some like vocabulary that we'll be going over today. The first one is an IP address, and that's just a unique identifier of a device on a network. So you can think of IP addresses as a house, where each house might be on the same street, but they all have different identifications, which is the numbers of the house. Then we have a subnet mask, which sets the boundaries of your network. We have a router, which helps manage traffic in between different networks. We have your default gateway, which is like the path traffic would take to go out of your local network. You have services, and that's just like something that you can request to get information from. For example, a web server can request a web page, and that would give you your web page. We have protocols, which are just ways that data is formatted, how it looks, and how it's validated. We've got ports. If an IP address is a house, a port would be a room. And different ports have different functionalities, just like how your kitchen has a different function than your bedroom. We've got interface and firewalls as well. Oh, and an interface is kind of like the door to your house. So it helps make that connection. And a firewall is like a lock, so it will block or allow connections. And this is like a deeper look into IP addresses and subnet masks. So an IP address or an IPv4 address is a sequence of four 8-bit numbers separated by a decimal point. And the range of these numbers that you can have are 0 to 255. The subnet mask below helps identify which numbers are like static or like what's a part of the network and what is able to be changed or like the host. In this example, your IP address is 192.168.1.100. The subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. And because the first three octets have the highest possible number that you can have, that means 192.168.1 is your network ID, and the host is the .100. So any device on this network will have a network ID of 192.168.1, and the last number can change depending on which device it is. Oh, in the chat, a default gateway is essentially the default path traffic goes in when it's leaving a local network. And now we're going to go into competition networking. And this just makes the services either work or not work. So first, we have this blue section and the yellow section. The yellow section is mostly out of scope for us, and the blue section is what we have control over. So the core router on the very bottom is like the main router of the competition. That's how different teams get access to the internet. And that's connected to a pod router. And the pod router is for like each team has their own router to handle incoming and outgoing traffic from the core network and your own pod network. In your pod network, you've got your blue team servers, which you are in charge of defending against red team. And usually this pod network will have an a network ID of 192.168.1.0. And in the core network, there's also a scoring engine. The scoring engine makes a connection to the pod router and your services and your servers to ensure that your services are being scored, and it's able to display real-time data of your service checks. Red team is also on the core network, and they're trying to actively take down your services. So while it's important to make sure that the scoring engine is able to access your services, it's also important to make sure that red team cannot. And now we'll be going into NAT. NAT stands for Network Address Translation, and this is pretty much used to conserve IP addresses. On the bottom, it's an example of a one-to-many translation where multiple addresses on one network gets translated to a single address on another network. In the chat, it says, if the scoring engine and red team are on different IPs, can't we just deny red team IP access via their router? Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's easy that way, but red team is also very skilled. Yes, Evan.
Why doesn't that necessarily work? More often?
Sometimes the servers, like the blue team servers, also have open connections, and those connections go through the router. So red team might be able to go through into using the services, or they can maybe use different IPs. It's also really hard. It's not hard to find their IPs, or it just might take a lot of time to figure out which IP is their IP and not like a scoring engine IP. Yeah, so in this example, going back to the one-to-many translation, again, it's taking multiple addresses on one network and translating it to a single address on another network. This also works with port forwarding or PAT, which is port address translation, and that helps tie specific services down to a specific port. So you'll be able to access them using like the public IP in addition to that port. So in this example, you have your client, which is, for example, you, like if you're using your computer, your PC, and you're trying to access the web server and the file server. So because there is a one-to-many translation on these devices, you can access both the web server and the file server using the 172.16.30.144 address. And again, you would have to specify a port to specify which server you want to access. Next, we have a one-to-one NAT, which is probably my favorite type of NAT. And this is a direct translation between two networks. So instead of where in one-to-many NAT, you would have two addresses that end up becoming one, you would just have one address that gets directly translated to another address. So in this example, we have a private address or a private network of 192.168.1.0 and another network, which is 172.16.30.0. And the last octet during this translation gets preserved. So for instance, if you're a client and you want to access the web server, you can just go to 172.16.30.30 instead of, yeah. And a one-to-one NAT translation is you could use a one-to-one NAT translation instead of a one-to-many translation if you want to have multiple services on the same port. So where a one-to-many translation, you want to have like two web servers, then you would have to have, it's really hard to have one IP have two functionalities on the same like port. So if you wanted to hit a specific web server and you want to hit port 80, you might be sent to like the other one, or it's just not going to work at all. And with this, you can have multiple web servers all on port 80 in the same network. So the question in chat is, so one-to-one allows you to communicate to a specific server without specifying a port. You still need to specify a port most of the time, or like pretty much all of the time. It's just if you have the same services, or like similar services on the same port number. Yes, you still need to specify which service you want to use. And now we'll be going over the client server model, and this acts pretty much like a restaurant. So here you have a client and a server. They're on different networks, but they are connected by the internet. And this is similar to how a client would be a diner and your server is your server or your waiter at a restaurant. So first, your client attempts to make a connection to the server. This is like a diner telling a waiter what they want to eat. And if that connection is valid, the server will respond. So if you're in a restaurant, the server or the waiter will respond with the food that the diner wanted to eat. And now we're going to go into what ports are. Ports, like I mentioned before, are kind of like rooms if an IP address is a house. And um, most ports that we will be using have services tied down to them. Um, and these are some of the common port numbers associated with services. However, not all of the time these services and these port numbers will be tied to each other. So it usually is like this, but it doesn't always have to be like this. So port 20 and 21 are used for FTP, which is file transfer protocol. Port 22 is used for SSH, which is just a way to remote into another machine. Port 25 is for SMTP, which is Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and that's for mail. Port 53 is for DNS, which is Domain Name Server or Service, and that's a way for you to access services without using the IP address. So for instance, if you want to go to Google, you could just type in google.com instead of the IP address of the Google web server. So it uses the domain name instead of an IP address. Then we have port 80, which is for HTTP, and that is an unencrypted web server. We have port 443, which is HTTPS, and that's similar to HTTP, but it's encrypted with TLS. And there's a lot more common ports as well. You should definitely research them. And these aren't things that you just know. You kind of have to memorize them through practice. And now we'll be going over protocols. And again, a protocol is pretty much how it specifies how data can be formatted, sent, and if the data gets validated or not. So first we have TCP, and TCP is usually pretty slow, but it's reliable. It has synchronization and flow control. It also does a TCP handshake, which we'll go over later on. And TCP checks for errors and does data validation, so it ensures that the data being sent isn't corrupted, nor does it have errors. UDP is typically fast but unreliable because it has no error checking. It doesn't use acknowledgements, it just keeps throwing data. However, in today's world, as technology is getting better and the networks are more reliable, UDP tends to be more, or it can be more reliable than TCP because TCP has a lot of overhead and some unnecessary checks. So this is an example of what TCP and UDP look like. So for example, on the left here, we have a TCP handshake between a sender and a receiver. So the sender sends out a SYN or a synchronized message to the receiver. The receiver acknowledges that and sends a synchronized acknowledge message or SYN-ACK. Then the sender acknowledges that and sends out an acknowledge or ACK message. On the right, we have UDP, also between a sender and a receiver. So the receiver sends a request to the sender, and the sender just keeps sending a data response. And again, there are no acknowledgements in here, so it's a lot faster. And now we'll be going into sockets. And sockets are just a pairing between an IP address and a port, and it's a way for devices to communicate with each other. On the bottom in bold are two examples of sockets. Sockets are the IP address with the port appended to it at the end. So for example, if we have like a client here and a web server here, the client wants to make a connection to the web server, and it will use a high ephemeral port to connect to port 80 on the server. And an ephemeral port is a port that's not tied down to a specific service, but it is tied down to a process. So it doesn't have a service used on it. It's just used to make socket connections between devices and other services. And ephemeral ports are on the client side of things. And this is important to know especially during competitions, because it can, one, help you identify traffic. So you can see if traffic coming from different addresses, like is it normal traffic coming from the scoring engine or the orange team, or is it suspicious traffic coming from the red team? This can also help you troubleshoot some of your services. So for instance, why your service isn't being scored. Is there a firewall issue, or maybe the service is disabled? I'm going to skip this slide because you can all come back to it later. And now we'll be going over firewalls, which are not water walls. And if you've competed before, you would understand. So firewalls are network security tools, and they pretty much help you allow or block traffic. So firewalls can help you block IPs. This can be an individual IP. For instance, if you notice that there's a suspicious connection between you and maybe red team, you could be able to block that IP. You can also block a whole subnet if you want to. Firewalls can also block ports. So if you want specific services to have connections allowed, you would allow those port connections and block all the other ones. There's also filtering with firewalls, such as ingress and egress. Ingress is incoming traffic, egress is outgoing traffic. And you can pair this directional use with ports to get very specific rules that will make your security a lot more tight-knit. And this is very useful during competition, because we can specify which services we want going inbound and if we want outbound connections to different things. Usually we don't want outbound connections, but we'll go into that soon. So we'll be going over two types of firewalls. We have a host firewall, which is on a single device, and we have a network firewall, which is on a router, a switch, or another dedicated device. On your host firewall, it filters traffic from inbound and outbound it filters inbound and outbound traffic on a single device, which means there are only two rule sets that you have to worry about. And for instance, this could be like a Windows firewall. So the network firewall filters traffic on the WAN and the LAN networks. LAN is your local area network, and in this example, it's everything on the left here. And a WAN is a wider area network, and that is everything on this side. And the WAN is either usually the internet or just a larger, different network. And because it filters inbound and outbound traffic on both networks, you have 4 different rule sets to worry about. And an example of a network firewall is a Cisco firewall. Now, we'll be talking about stateless and stateful firewalls. A stateless firewall doesn't remember the connections it's made before. It really only cares about like the connection and the direction that it's going in and doesn't care about the end of the like what it's connecting to at the end. And when you have stateless firewalls, you have to make many specific rules. So for example, if you want to allow traffic from all devices trying to connect to port 80 going inbound, you'd have to make a rule for every single IP address trying to connect to port 80 going inbound. Stateful firewalls are nicer, and they do remember those connections. So for instance, again, if you want to allow connections for IP addresses going inbound on port 80, you would only need to make a rule that's allowing inbound connections on port 80, because all of the traffic that's been established before will continue to have this connection and data can move between the end device and the server. Now we'll be talking about new gen or next gen firewall and the traditional firewall. So NGFWs are enterprise network dedicated devices and are usually pretty expensive to have. It's really good about like filtering traffic. So for instance, if you're at school or at work, or even at home, if you have that money, you could block traffic going to specific websites. So for example, if you're at school and a lot of students are making connections to like cool math games or something, and the school doesn't like that, they'll just block connections to cool math games. Traditional firewalls are like your normal host level firewalls. And there's less functionality than NGFWs, and they are able to filter traffic based on direction and the port number. This is an example of firewall rules that we would implement for like competition or just general use. So for inbound connections, you want to only allow the services that you need, certain subnets such as your team's subnet, and certain IP addresses, such as the IP address of your host machine, if you want to like get remote access into the server. And you want to block everything going outbound, which means you won't have access to the internet. And you want to block outbound because sometimes a team has devices in your servers that connects to an external device and they'll send traffic in between each other. Yeah, so it's very important to block or to allow inbound connections, but also to block outbound connections. Wouldn't, in the chat, somebody's asking, wouldn't blocking all outbound traffic prevent info from flowing to the scoring engine? Usually, we have stateful firewalls. So the traffic being sent in between your inbound can make that connection back to your outbound. Yes,
State firewall, I mean, there's unstable firewalls and what would the difference be?
I went over that. That's crazy. So the question was, what's the difference between a stateful and stateless firewall? And I'll go over that again. A stateless firewall just means that the connections that have been made are not remembered. So you would have to make very specific rules for every IP address that you want to have a connection from. And then a stateful firewall remembers those connections. So you only have to have like one firewall rule that allows connections because there have been connections previously. And when those are established, there can be data flowing in between like your end device and your server. All right. And this is an example of a WAN firewall on a pfSense. The pfSense is a firewall that, or sorry, it's a router that we have for most of our labs. And it has a web server on it that you can access to help with your configurations. So this is an example of a WAN firewall, and it looks like it's allowing traffic with that has a source IP address of 172.16.109.39. Yeah, so it's allowing all traffic with that IP source, for that source IP. And now we have a LAN firewall. So the first rule is an anti-lockout rule. Um, yeah, you can get locked out pretty easily if you don't have these rules. And that first one allows any, like all traffic to make a connection to the LAN address on ports 443 and 80. The rule below that is a deny rule, and it's denying all other traffic. The two rules below that allow all traffic with the source IP of the LAN network. However, because these rules are evaluated in order of like in top-down order, that deny rule is above the two bottom rules, and those two bottom rules won't be counted at all. Yeah, and now it's time for the lab. I promise you it's not Cisco Packet Tracer. You can access the lab here. It's very fast. It should be easy. If you guys need help at all, please like DM us or ask us anywhere. The Discord chat, like the CCDC homework Discord channel is always open too. I'll put that in the chat. Yeah, thanks guys for listening. I know this is really quick. It's actually a lot faster than I expected. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, yes. No. Yeah, there's no sign up sheet for the summer, but there will be for the fall. So yeah, if you want to try out for the team, you will need to be a part of the fall boot camps. Yeah. Are there
I
any?
have a question regarding the homework.
Yes.
Yeah, so you said this won't be occurring in Packet Tracer. So will this be happening in those virtual machines you guys gave us the credentials for in the email?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not working right now though.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure that out as soon as we can.
But when
But
it starts working, we just refer to the VMs to do the homework. Is that correct?
yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.